Scrolling requires a steady hand, is my problem. Okay, this is a map of my neighborhood that I constructed a couple of years ago. On the north, we got Highway 10, and the south is West Park Tollway. On the left is Highway 6, and on the right is Highway 8. And all those little yellow pins in there are exempt church properties. These are properties that do not pay taxes. And since this is several years old, and I still live in the neighborhood, I see a lot of churches still going up. So we're talking about an active issue. Okay. This is a list of the largest churches in Houston, largest on the basis of attendance. Number one, you're not going to be surprised to see, is Lakewood. Number two, Second Baptist. Woodlands is also familiar to you. You might not be familiar with the last two. But these are 5 churches which are in the top 50 in the United States, i.e. Houston's big on churches, okay? Certainly big on church attendance. But for our purposes today, no wheel, no click.
Maybe a little closer to the computer on the. There you go.
But today we're going to be talking about church properties, not how many people attend, but how much is the property worth. And when you look at just the list in Harris County, remember the previous group was the United States, in Harris County, number 1 becomes Champions, okay, because they have the most expensive church property around. Second Baptist drops to second, or stays at second. Second Baptist also happens to be third, but that's a technicality we can talk about later. But what was number 1 before now becomes number 8. Don't worry about reading the chart. You're going to get a hard copy of it in a while. Okay? This is not a reading test. All right, so how did these tax exemptions get started? How did we get in this situation? Around 312, Constantine granted an exemption to the churches there, a Christian church. Now, it's not clear whether he gave them the exemption because they prayed for his side and his side won, or he became a believer. But anyway, this was, as far as we know, the first church property tax exemption. Later on, church property in England was exempt. The reason it was exempt there was they provided services to the state, such as recording births and deaths and logistical things like that. Later on, there was the English statute of charitable uses, which gave property tax exemptions to all nonprofit organizations. Okay, all nonprofits, not specifically churches. Now, this piece of legislation became the foundation of the church legislation in the United States. Of the 13 original colonies, 9 gave some sort of tax relief to churches. 77, Virginia exempted houses of divine worship. Then New York did it in 99. And in 1870, Congress exempted the houses of divine worship, but only in the D.C. area. Okay. Now, these exemptions were not granted without being contested. I'm afraid they wouldn't be contested today. But back in the 1800s, they were contested. In fact, 3 presidents spoke out against granting these exemptions. James Madison was the first. Second was President Grant. And I want to read what he had to say to Congress. This is a politician speaking in front of Congress. 7th annual message to the Congress on December 7th, 1875. I would also call your attention to the importance of correcting an evil that, if permitted to continue, will probably lead to great trouble in our land before the close of the 19th century. It is the accumulation of vast amounts of untaxed church property. In 1850, I believe the church property of the United States, which paid no tax, municipal or state, amounted to about $83 million. In 1860, the amount had doubled. In 1875, it's about $1 billion. By 1900, without check, it is safe to say this property will reach a sum exceeding $3 billion. So vast a sum, receiving all the protection and benefits of government without bearing its proportion of the burden and expenses of same, will not be looked upon acquiescently by those who have to pay the taxes. In a growing country where real estate enhances so rapidly with time, as in the United States, there is scarcely a limit to the wealth that may be acquired by corporations, religious or otherwise, if allowed to retain real estate without taxation. This is a politician who was at least willing to say these things up front back then. Next, Garfield also spoke on it. He just said that the divorce between church and state ought to be absolute. It ought to be so absolute that no church property anywhere in any state or in the nation should be exempt from equal taxation. For if you exempt the property of any church organization, to that extent, you impose a tax upon the whole community, which is pretty much the way I think many of us think about it here. Okay, so we went to, in the U.S., we enacted finally some federal legislation in 1894. Notice this is after the three presidents had spoken. This provided exemptions for solely charitable, religious, or educational purposes. All right. Now, there was a bright moment there when this act got repealed. However, it didn't last. It got reinstated by the Revenue Act of 1913. Now, in 1921, the parsonage exemption was added. Now, I'm not talking about the parsonage exemption primarily today, but the parsonage exemption is interesting because it's an exemption that applies only to religious institutions, not other nonprofits, and it exempts from taxation the properties of preachers, essentially. Okay? All right, now, the federal legislation in this area, we can be proud to say that Lyndon did a nice thing here when he made it illegal for churches to intervene in political campaigns. He did this in 1954. On the other hand, the Supreme Court in 1970 upheld tax exemptions for the churches at 8-1 by a margin of 8-1, which is a big margin indicating we've got a problem if we're going to get rid of these. In 1983, the Supreme Court upheld the 1954 Johnson Amendment. So it seems strong in that area, but not so much in getting them to pay property taxes. All right. Even with our legislation, we managed to put in a little paperwork. Non-exempt organizations are supposed to, but are not required to, file tax forms. They file a 990. There are 3 990s. The 990N is the short form, little card on the left. So if you're a beginner at this, you fill out one of those. If your church is doing less than $50,000 a year in business, okay? Not required. Let me make this really clear. You're not required to file at all. If you're over 50,000 and under 300,000 receipts and 500,000 in capital assets, then you can require. What happened here? I went ahead. I skipped. I did wrong here. I'll go to the next one. Here are the tax forms. I'm sorry. Okay. An interesting thing about these forms is they all have places for recording what the church's website is. I was really struck by that. I thought that was, how did this come up? I think it's a great idea. And all churches, by law, have to make these forms available for your inspection. So you do have a right to look at them. Go back to who must file. These are the rules on who must file. Every organization exempt from the federal income tax under the Internal Revenue Code section 501A, which includes 501c3, must file an annual information return, except 1, you're a church. 2, you're an auxiliary church. 3, you're a church-affiliated organization. 4, you're a school or below college level affiliated with a church. 5, you're church-affiliated admission. 6, you're a religious activity. Which is another way of saying, if you're anyway mixed up with religion, you don't need to file anything. Okay? Okay. So how do we find out how much money this is costing us? How much are we losing because of these exemptions, which are certainly not a universal application since we're left out? What you do what I did, I went to the Harris County Property Tax website, and to the best of my ability, started sucking data out of there. And I ended up with 16,000 tax items. Now, what's a tax item? All right, this is a typical form here for property tax. Up top is the account number. Below is the description of the property we're talking about taxing. Over here is who you send the tax bill to if you were to send one. Then we have the bottom line, and what's the total value of the property? Now this line may be zero, even if you've got the rest of the form there. Over here are the individual taxable organizations which are collecting money. In this case, he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different tax organizations are placing taxes on this property. And then over on the right column shows the amount he's going to end up paying. You may notice he had a 100% deduction in the second column, so it all comes out to be zero. Okay. Now, from looking at all these, what did we learn? Jim? Where did Jim go? Here's Jim. Jim's going to hand out some things because this next slide is an eye chart. What it does, it explains to you for each tax jurisdiction how much they collect and how much they lose. How much to not collect. Yeah, well, it's fine. You'll learn what the budgets look like for each tax. Yes, sir.
Fred, are there secular organizations that use the religious concept so that they can get the deduction?
Well, secular organizations, as long as they're nonprofits, don't need to use the church thing. They still get the deduction. We're talking property taxes now. We're not talking property.
Yeah, I'm talking about
Okay.
property.
Yeah. So they don't have to. I mean, they should be 501c3s anyway. Now, as to whether some scammers might do that, heaven forbid. When I was looking at the list of churches, I thought things like the Church of Free Sex Now, and strange things on all these churches. Yes, sir.
To answer your question a little bit further, one of the biggest property owners uses scheme is the Church of England. They're one of the biggest property owners in the state. And they buy like sugarcane plantations.
Okay, I didn't want to get off into a discussion. If you want to, give an addendum at the end, I think that'd be appropriate.
Well, I just,
Okay, if you look at the chart, you'll see column 1 on the spreadsheet just lists the jurisdictions that are of interest in Harris County. Column 2 tells you the tax rate for that jurisdiction. Column 3 tells you how much is the dollar value of the declared materials for that exemption. 4 is the number of religious properties in a given jurisdiction. So if you look at your area and then look at column 4, you see how many churches you've got in that district. 4 is the number of valued properties. 5 is the number of valued properties. 6 is the number of unvalued properties. They just put an estimate of 0. So how do we get a value there? It's kind of interesting. So what I did, we extended the exemptions and said, well, the number of properties that gave a value of 0 is probably equal in proportion to how many properties gave a number. So we just weighted it the same amount. But then we come to the mystery column. How do we get a count of the number of churches that did not register? Well, that's kind of tricky. Now remember this slide we saw earlier, but these two guys don't file. So the biggies don't file as well as the littlies, all right? So we're transparent there. But the other challenge was, well, how many are there? I still don't know. This is a study put out by the Internal Revenue Service in 2003, I think. And it tells you how many non-filing churches there are. The white bar on top is, the black bar on top is the number who filed, and the gray section beneath it says these how many churches did not file. So we've got from this chart we can get a ratio, how many filed to how many didn't file. The only kicker with this ratio is that the black part includes legitimate tax-exempt organizations, because this is all tax exempts. So if we don't count those, we of course get a bigger ratio of the dark part to the white part. Well, let's assume that they're all religious organizations. This is the conservative approach. So doing that, we come up with a multiplier of about 2.6 to get the number that are not filing. So we factor that into column 8, and we call that phantom exemptions. So that's, and then total exemptions 9 is just adding columns 3, 7, and 8. And then column 10, this is just a read out number, some blanks there. What are the budgets for these jurisdictions? How much of their money are we getting? And if you look in the last couple of columns, I guess column 13 is the most interesting. How much do they lose in property tax receipt? What percentage of their budget is lost in these property receipts? So you can look for your own jurisdiction there. And the real important number, of course, is at the bottom of the page. How much money is this costing Harris County every year? $350 million, a third of $1 billion is lost. Now, what could we do with a third of $1 billion in Harris County? Well, that's a significant number. That's a fair piece of change. You're talking about, getting well underway with your light rail or building roads, schools, a couple of schools. So that's being lost. So how does this compare to other studies? This is a study done by the New York City Budget Office, and they were looking at, this is a property tax exemption for nonprofit study. And Philadelphia is the large item on the left. They lose approximately 11% to a tax-exempt organization, and that's Houston there. So you can see we're right in the middle there, around 8%. So in the big picture, what does it look like for the country? Oh, we know it's a significant amount. Anybody happen to see Going Clear on HBO last week? A fantastic show. I mean, it shows you how seriously people want to get property tax exemptions. They'll do all sorts of things. But anyway, in the bigger picture, we see that property tax is just part of the whole thing. And a study by Cragen down at the University of Tampa came up with a number of $71 billion per year for the country. 71 billion. And then there was a later add-on to that that said, oh, you forgot to count people sending in money and some other things. So they're currently at an $83.5 billion a year cost of these property tax exemptions. As Grant said, there's scarcely a limit to the wealth that may be acquired by corporations, religious or otherwise, if allowed to retain real estate without taxation. Now, my numbers, I can defend these. These are really conservative numbers. I believe we have a serious problem, and if we don't do something about it, our community, at least, is going to get into serious trouble. We've seen other nearby communities consider going without property tax exemptions. But nobody's ever done it. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you to get your pitchforks out and put them away.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so, okay, we are kind of short on time here because we do have to have Amanda's presentation, but we do have just a few minutes for Q&A, so please try to keep your questions brief and to the point. So, go ahead. Any questions back there?
You also look at the way that property is no longer lost from the churches just because of the lack of taxes.
Is the property,
Well, have you looked at the way that property won't be lost back into private hands because of the lack of taxation? So church properties that can be allowed to decay because there's no incentive to release them back into other uses.
so we need a way to motivate churches to relinquish property they're not using?
Exactly, because you see these properties decay, and it can actually be a detriment to their communities. But there's no incentive to clean it up. There's no incentive to relinquish it, because even though it's actually impacting the rest of the community, there's no tax on it to give them any incentive.
I think that's a great point. I wish there was some way we could recover. I hadn't thought of that.
Anyone else? Sir, Jim?
Oh, Fred, if you could come back to the mic. If you come back to the mic.
Jim?
Yeah, Fred, another thing we haven't talked about is all the extra property besides the churches itself. Like the Methodists, they own that whole block across from KCG Center. They got a whole school system, and they have it.
Well, if you, the question is, yeah, there's property which does not have a church on it, you're saying?
Yeah, I wonder how much of that's coming in your.
Oh, I got that. I did not discriminate that. All of the tax things, I collected on the basis of who was the owner. If the owner had, church or religious or missionary or ecclesiast or that sort of thing in its name, then I was able to include it in my database. Of course, if it had something like Mary Ecclesiast, then I had to delete it. But yeah, we were able to go through all those. If it was a vacant lot, if the church owned it, I should have gotten it. Yes, sir.
Did you see, I can't remember what issue it was, but an issue of free inquiry, I think it was last year, it was at the beginning of the year, some fellow wrote showing the effects of all the tax exemptions, not just property exemptions, but he included every kind of exemption that churches receive in this country, and he totaled it to well over $100 billion.
Well, I hope he got a bigger number than that, because I came up with 81 billion here. This is a pretty well-known study.
Yeah, that was the Center for Inquiry study, but they used the most conservative figures they could possibly use. With every single number, they went as low as possible to get the absolute minimum.
Yeah, this, the Cragen study was 71 billion a year. So, yeah, that was consistent. I did skip over this. The New York City budget says they lose 627 million a year in property taxes, just New York City. Yes, sir.
Are these organizations exempt from taxes on their income taxes as well, on their normal operating revenues, or just property taxes?
Not as far as I was tracking. I only looked at property. There are a lot of other strange things. For instance, I forgot to mention, and you all should be on the lookout for this. Did anybody happen to have any information about the $600,000? Thank you. Hold on. Did anybody get information about the $600,000 theft from Lakewood Church last March? Okay. They're offering a $25,000 reward if they can get any information about that. So their send-ins there account for over 32 million a year. Yeah, plus send-in dollars.
Well, that was just one weekend, right?
Yeah, that was one weekend's pickup. That was just the cash contributions were $200,000, $400,000 in checks, and then they had mail-ins in addition to that. So it's good business. Any more questions?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to go ahead and move on. Sorry, Liz. Yeah,
One quick
well,
thing, we toss around $1 billion, 2 or 3 billion here, 4 or 5 billion there. You never stop to think how much that is. $1 billion is $1 every 60 seconds for 2,000 years. Now think about it.
All right. So yeah, please give a hand again to Fred Thorlin.